Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know. As it seems, the American dream ain't nothing but another calculated scheme to get us locked up, shot up and back in chains, to deny us of the future, rob our name, kept my history a mystery, but now I see the American dream wasn't meant for me, cause Lady Liberty's a hypocrite, she lied to me, promised me freedom, education, equality, never gave me nothing but slavery, and now look at how dangerous you made me, calling me a madman, cause I'm strong and bold, with this gun full of knowledge of the lies she told, promised me emancipation, and this new nation. All you ever gave my people was salvation. Fathers of this country never cared for me. They kept my ancestors shackled up in slavery. And Uncle Sam never did a damn thing for me, except lie about the facts in my history. So now I'm sitting here mad cause I'm unemployed. But the government's glad cause they enjoy when my people are down so they can screw us around. Time to change the government now. Panther power. Panther power.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, May 25th, 2024. We begin with our dear ancestor and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamati, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. Then, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Isaac Saney, associate professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada, and author of the book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Musa Springer, pro-Cuba solidarity activist / journalist, as well as Shaquille Fontenot, co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. And that's not all. We'll also be enjoying some messages from our brother behind the walls, Mumia Abu Jamal, by way of prison radio, keeping our minds tuned into the ongoing genocidal war crimes against Palestine. It's all right here, so stay tuned. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Tupac Shakur, Russell Gunn, Ahmad Jamal, Curtis Fuller, Donald Harrison, and Wayne Shorter. Now, people, get ready for this train coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation. And stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a message from Mumia Abu Jamal and an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Isaac Saney.
Hotep, this is Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, where we provide a thumbnail overview of significant events and personalities in the historical process for social revolution. May 26, 1799, Alexander Pushkin, an African who is the greatest Russian poet of all times, was born. He was immortalized by the Russian Revolution as a literary revolutionary. Pushkin pioneered the use of vernacular speech in his poems and plays, creating a style of storytelling mixing drama, romance, and satire. May 27, 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar unite in the Pan-African spirit to form the East African country of Tanzania. May 28, 1851, Sojourner Truth speaks about the triple oppression of African women facing racism, poverty, and sexism at the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. Her most famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" attacked European society for placing white women on a pedestal and giving them privileges while African women were commoditized, raped, brutalized, and sold into slavery. May 24th, 1944. Maurice Bishop, leader of the New Jewel movement and architect of the Grenadian Revolution in the Caribbean, was born. The United States subsequently invades Grenada, a country the size of Compton, with Operation Fury to overthrow the government of the New Jewel movement and replace it with a U.S. puppet neocolonial regime. May 30th, 1954, the National Liberation Front of Algeria begins armed struggle against French settler colonialism. After decades of human rights protests, over 1.5 million Algerians and 27,000 French soldiers died in the bloodiest war fought on the African continent. Algeria was a jewel in the French Empire, with over 1 million French relocating to Algeria and occupying the best agricultural lands and controlling businesses. Egypt, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, provided the base for the Algerian Revolution. May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old martyr and Catholic heroine, was burned at the stake. She led 6,000 Frenchmen to free France from English colonization during the 100-Year War. May 31st, 1779, George Washington, the first president, was called the Town Destroyer, a nickname given to him by the Iroquois Native Americans. In the summer of 1779, Washington ordered the United States Army to conduct a scorched earth campaign that destroyed at least 40 Iroquois villages in central and upstate New York. The purpose was to ethnically cleanse New York for European settlement. May 28th, the first century, the Trung sisters, Trac and Nia, led an uprising against Chinese domination of their country, Vietnam. Trac gained the trust of the Vietnamese people by her killing a tiger that was frightening the people in the populous village. She used the tiger's skin as a parchment to write a proclamation urging her people to rise up against Chinese domination. Her sister Nia was a fearless warrior who chose 36 women, including her mother, and trained them to be generals. These women, general, led a people's army of 80,000, including men, which drove out the Chinese in 40 AD. June 1st, 1900, Samori Touré, an African freedom fighter, dies in a French prison. Samori led a long war against French colonial rule in Guinea, West Africa. 60 years later, with his grandson Sekou Touré and the Democratic Party of Guinea leads the independence movement to free Guinea from French colonial rule. Sekou Touré is one of the co-founders of the modern-day Pan-Africanist movement. June 1st, 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed, which abolished the slave trade in the British Empire, but not slavery itself. As slave uprising continued to occur throughout the world, slavery itself was abolished by the British Empire in 1833. June 1st, 1970, Libya in North Africa expels the last of 8,000 U.S. troops from Wheelus Air Force Base, thereby concluding the African nationalization of Libya from all foreign forces and multinational oil corporations. June 1st, 1956, Tunisia, a Mediterranean country in North Africa, gains independence under leadership of Habib Bourguiba and the Destour Party. Tunisia is the historical home of the famous Phoenician city of Carthage. Tunisia, though predominantly a Muslim country, practiced religious tolerance where Christians, Jews, and atheists all live in harmony. June 1st, 1975, the George Jackson Brigade, a European support group for political prisoners, bombs the Department of Correction headquarters in Washington State. The George Jackson Brigade was a part of the militant prisoners' rights support movement. In its 3 years' existence, it claimed 11 bombings, 10 bank robberies, and targeted the FBI, Bureau of Indian Affairs, corporations, and the Department of Corrections. June 1st, 1919, Red Summer takes off, called Red for the blood of Africans that spilled throughout the United States in a massive series of race wars. These pogroms were launched by whites against blacks over a black teenager swimming near the white side of a segregated beach. Over 26 cities and uncounted smaller towns were victimized by the frenzied assault by thousands of whites against black homes, businesses, schools, and churches. Thousands were murdered. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now. This program can be reheard for the next 90 days by going to kpfk.org under Audio Archive scroll to Freedom Now. Please join us in a unity chant of a mandala Awetu 3 times. A mandala Awetu means we the people are the power. We the people have the power. We the people will be the power.
Punished for protesting. Across the nation, as students raise their hands and voices in protest against what U.S. President Joseph Biden has called indiscriminate bombing of Gazan civilians, they're also facing punishments and repression by colleges and universities, not to mention the violence and brutality of police. Students who are protesting the immense violence of the Israeli apartheid state are subjected to American state violence. What's wrong with this picture? Americans believe that they are free to protest under the protections of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Tell that to the cops. Tell that to campus administrators. In truth, if the positions taken by protesters are controversial enough, disturbing enough, they are subject to state and administrative repression. They are beaten, locked up. They are suspended and expelled. Where is the constitutional protection? Here's the hard truth. There is none. Period. In fact, civil suits may be filed and they may even be won. But don't forget, the damage is done. Legal relief after a beating ain't no relief at all. That's because legal systems protect power relations. They protect the status quo. Students who protest for justice against injustice, against racist violence, should be celebrated, lauded, and applauded. That is not yet the case. But they're doing something noble, something deeply human. They care for the oppressed. kudos for that. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Isaac Saney, Associate Professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada, and author of the book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Isaac Saney.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure.
Ditto. So why did you write this book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End?
Well, I was interested in, obviously, Cuba's role in Africa, why Africa occupies a privileged space in the Cuban Revolution's foreign policy, and also to explicate specifically how the defeat of the South African, the so-called invincible South African armed forces in Southern Africa, particularly in 87-88, in which the Cubans played such a decisive, critical, and central role, how it accelerated the end of apartheid. Quite often people talk about that it's the victors who write the history of the wars. But in this case, what has happened is this role of Cuba has been deleted, has been erased, has been ignored, right? And so that was one of the particular reasons. I also think, as Fidel Castro himself said, it's one of the most brilliant pages of the Cuban Revolution. He spoke about this. And I wanted to be able to tell the story. Cubans, obviously too busy fighting the imperial beast to have actually spent the detailed time to have told the story. So I was very happy to have been granted significant access in Cuba, for interviews, for archival research, as well as doing a significant amount of archival research and interviews in South Africa, as well as looking at documents that were declassified in the United States and so forth. So it's to tell this powerful story, and also, in a sense, to look at Cuba as a Pan-African actor, right? To see Cuba as part of and parcel of the struggle against white supremacy, which is so integral to world capitalism. When we think of, that's my daughter in the background, when we think of the Russian Revolution, for example, the Great October Revolution, we often think of it, obviously, and quite correctly, as a workers' uprising, right? As a rising of the oppressed. But it also was a significant blow against white supremacy, because the Russian Revolution took up the struggle against anti-colonial struggles. Cuba can be seen in that context, particularly, as I would say, in the last part of the 1980s and so on. The last point I'd like to make as well is I also placed the war in the context of what was South Africa's war of terror, waged, what is often referred to as the war of destabilization, waged from 1975 to 1988, that cost hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. And in historical terms, that recently is a recent event, because the major battles ended in 1988, so to speak, right? So this is a recent occurrence that people often don't talk about, that there was this major war of terrorism waged by the apartheid state that has left, I would argue, untold economic, material, and particularly human scars in that region.
Mm-hmm. Now, we also know that in addition to sending thousands of soldiers to fight against apartheid and imperialism and colonialism in Southern Africa, more specifically Angola, Cuba also has sent doctors and medics to Africa as well. Could you talk to us about that also?
Yeah. So over the course of the Cuban Revolution, over 400,000 doctors have probably served in over 60-something countries in Cuba, right? At the moment that we speak, there's probably 30 to 35,000 Cuban doctors serving in a variety of countries. And Africa was given a privileged space in Cuban foreign policy. And I think it's important to understand that one of the first places that Cuba provided assistance to in Africa was the Algerian national liberation struggle. They then developed very close relationships with the Lusophone countries, the former Portuguese colonies of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. And they developed a very particularly close relationship with them. okay, a very close relationship with these countries. And so Cuba very early on identified with the African anti-colonial national liberation struggles. We also know that Che Guevara played a particular role in Congo after the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, trying to initiate an anti-colonial national liberation struggle. And so there's always been this powerful relationship and a recognition that because of Cuba's link to the transatlantic slave trade, the fact that such a significant portion of Cubans have African ancestry, that Cuba holds, as does the rest of the world, a particular debt to Africa. And this has been articulated several times by Cuba. In fact, Fidel Castro in the middle of the 70s was the first Latin American country to openly and publicly articulate that Cuba about the role of Africa as part of the historical heritage of Cuba, calling Cuba a Latin African country. And in fact, even before that, in 1966, when he was in a meeting with Amilcar Cabral, when Cabral was talking about Cuba's immense assistance to African anti-colonial national liberation struggles, Fidel told Cabral that Cuba is Africa. And so there's this very profound connection, and Cuban doctors are even serving there, as we know. In the 2012, when the Ebola epidemic struck through West Africa, Cuba sent doctors and contingents, and people put their lives on the line to fight Ebola and so on. And so Cuba is always, and in fact, they articulated before the UN Security Council, the Cuban representative, who was one of the non-permanent representatives, articulated very clearly that humanity owes Africa a debt. So there's this very profound conception that runs through all levels of Cuban society, from those who hold significant African ancestry to those who see Cuba's assistance to Africa as part of elemental and necessary international solidarity, particularly with a continent that has suffered so much from the predations, the plundering, right, and the pillage of the imperial and colonial system.
Obviously, U.S. imperialism has a long memory. We know about its attempt over the decades to punish the Haitian Revolution. And likewise, there's been an attempt to punish the Cuban Revolution. Talk to us about the U.S. blockade against Cuba and what it is doing in terms of exacerbating suffering on the island.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the blockade of Cuba, which is really an economic war against Cuba, is an attempt to asphyxiate the country. And Cuba was seen as the unforgivable example. And when we talk about Cuba and Africa, we should also talk about the African diaspora. And I'm going to come back to the economic war. But Cuba also sees a parallel with its situation with that of Haiti. When the Haitian Revolution was launched in 1791, culminated in 1804 with the independence of the first Black Republic. Haiti was isolated, cordon sanitaire was imposed, and the imperial powers have never forgiven Haiti for being the unforgivable revolution. Cuba is the unforgivable revolution of the 20th century. And so Cuba is seen as this example that must be crushed, not only challenging U.S. imperialism and achieving its independence, but also being an example of socialism. An alternative system can be established. So very early on, the United States decided to asphyxiate Cuba economically. There's a famous Mallory memo from April of 1960. He was a functionary in the U.S. Department of State who sort of laid out and articulated that because the Cuban government, and I'm paraphrasing here, had significant popular support, the only alternative of the United States was to starve the country economically, to promote shortages, discontent, hunger and hardships, so as to promote popular discontent and an uprising. And of course, when Cuba had its relationship with the Soviet Union, up until the collapse of the Soviet bloc and Eastern Bloc in the early 1990s, Cuba was in a sense insulated to a certain part from the U.S. economic war. Of course, in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union Eastern Bloc, Cuba lost the major source of its trade, of its credits, and so forth. And the United States deepened through the Torricelli Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Bill of 1996, deepened the economic screws, so to speak, the war against Cuba in an attempt to asphyxiate the island. And of course, we know the island had a decline in the economy of over 35%, some people calculate, from 1989 to the middle of 1994. So there's been this attempt to sort of squeeze and crush the revolution, Yes, we had that interregnum period under Obama with the hyperaggression was lessened, but then we had with Trump, and then under Biden, and of course followed by Biden, this attempt to further, shall we say, fixate the revolution, to cut it off from financial outlets, to cut off its trade. For example, any ship that docks in a Cuban port is not allowed to dock in a U.S. port for over 6 months. This has increased, for example, the significant cost of shipping to Cuba. So, for example, take fuel, which is a big Achilles heel of Cuba and many of the countries in the Caribbean. One of the biggest Achilles heels is that, for example, buying fuel abroad because of shipping costs more than 3 times as much for Cuba to do this. There's the issue of food, right? There's the issue of so many other things as well. There's the fact that because Cuba was put as a last vindictive act by Trump on the so-called State Sponsors of Terrorism Act, State Sponsors of Terrorism list, that Cuba now since has faced a whole series of other overarching sanctions from the United States and so on. And sanctions that, for example, have made it very difficult for Cuba to obtain financing from banks and so forth to buy a number of the essential items it needs to keep the economy afloat. And so, for example, we know that over a period of a year, from last year to this year, I think from April to February, there were over 250 different financial transactions that Cuba was carrying on that were frustrated directly by the United States, right? This includes buying medicines, medical equipment, food, and so forth. So this is a war not just against the Cuban Revolution. It's obviously a war aimed at the Cuban people, simply because the revolution is supported by the immense majority of the Cuban people. So it is a war determined to destroy Cuba as a viable example of independence, but also a viable example that it's possible to organize your economy, not based on profit, not based on being enthralled to corporations and monopoly capital, but to use the resources in the service of the people. And so this is a huge challenge that Cuba faces, that the revolution has been facing.
Finally, Isaac Saney, Associate Professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada, author of the book Cuba, African Apartheid. As noted, you are cited in Nova Scotia, Canada, and there are those in our audience who recall that after George Washington and his comrades ousted the British from what was to become the United States, countless number of Black people with roots in Virginia, the Carolinas, and New York State, they fled to Nova Scotia, Canada. And I guess my question is, to what extent are their descendants still there? And to what extent is the presence of the original Black people who fled the United States, to what extent is their presence marked in Nova Scotia, Canada?
Well, first of all, I'm a descendant. My mother is a Black loyalist who came here in 1783. And the point that I've made and you've made is that during the American War of Independence, the so-called American Revolution, many more people of African descent fought on the British side, actually taking up the cause. That's my daughter in the background. Taking up the cause of, taking up the call from the British side that those who fought on the British side, because it was a militarily expedient action by the British, in a sense that they needed military personnel and so forth, that anyone who fought on their side would be granted freedom and a whole bunch of other privileges and so forth, right, like land and so forth. And so they took up this call. When the American War of Independence was over, the British lost. Over 3,500 ended up coming to Nova Scotia. And they were set up in various communities here. And of their promises of economic security, of land, of freedom were not kept. They were viciously segregated and marginalized. And Nova Scotia was also a province that had a history of slavery. So there were enslaved Africans here when the Black loyalists arrived. And so this impacted on them as well in how it shaped the society and how it treated people of African descent. But the Black loyalist communities that stayed here remained resilient, right? And of course, what's interesting is that in 1792, they were given the opportunity of returning to Africa. This was to Sierra Leone, which was a British colony at that time, to escape the broken promises, to escape the vicious exploitation that was unfolding here in Nova Scotia, because they were, in a sense, the principal source of cheap labor. And in fact, they were skilled cheap labor. And so around 1,200 of them, 1,196 to be precise, left and went to Sierra Leone. A very important example, I would argue, of the Black community exercising its self-determination, voting with their feet, as I say, and leaving Nova Scotia. The populations that remained were then joined by another major migration that takes place after the War of 1812. There's a one from the Maroons that takes place in 1796. Most of them live in 1800. But the next major migration numbers is over 2,000 that arrive after the War of 1812, replaying the same scenario that happened after the American War of Independence. And these two communities then merge together in a sense and form the basis of what we call the historical African Nova Scotian community, which is still here. That despite the trials and tribulations, the marginalization, disenfranchisement, segregation, right? In fact, we had, in many cases, we had what we were equivalent of dusk to dawn laws here in Nova Scotia. Okay, that they established significant communities. And in fact, we have one figure, Richard Preston, who arrives here looking for his mother after the War of 1812, okay, and establishes what is still the most important organization in the African Nova Scotian community. Okay, there you go. Well, they will be with you in a bit. Okay. The African United Baptist Association, which is an example of African Nova Scotian self-determination, right? And so the community continues to be incredibly resilient. And in fact, one point I'd like to make, becomes part of, various Pan-African trends that develop both in the United States and in Canada and globally. In fact, in the 1960s, one of the largest black political meetings at that time takes place in Halifax, bringing together representatives of the various communities across the province in what was called a black family meeting, leading the formation of the Nova Scotia Black United Front, in which people like Rocky Jones, who was from Nova Scotia, had interacted with people like Stokely Carmichael, Walter Rodney, and a whole number of other, shall we say, luminary figures in the black liberation movement of that time. So the black community is still here. The black community is resilient, vibrant, and it has done all it can to resist its disenfranchisement, marginalization, and has at various moments articulated organizationally, and I would argue in true what we call the African Nova Scotian cultural renaissance, a series of literary figures, its right to be, and also the very fact that it has very significant aspirations of self-determination. So I hope in a nutshell that sort of encompasses the fact that quite often people don't realize there's this black community that's been long-standing up here in Nova Scotia that has its own unique history, but is also part of the global black liberation struggle.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Isaac Saney, Associate Professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada, author of the book Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much for having me, and my daughter thanks you as well.
Oh, I appreciate that.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. We're going to keep this train a moving and send you back over to Prison Radio for a poem presented by Mumia Abu Jamal, which will immediately be followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined by Musa Springer and Shaquille Fontenot.
The Prisons, next time. It's a poem. A Sister Julia Wright. The daughters and sons of the students of 1968 have learned well the only university course worth its while. The revolution throughout the United States, throughout the territories stolen from the indigenous peoples. Our brave children looking the mass graves of Gaza in the eyes of building the only space worth its while. Liberation zones. They are claiming that their universities divest and cease exchanges with a fascist country, any fascist country, committing genocide. Staring the mass graves in the eye, they uphold Antigenes' unwritten law of humanity and the right to bury with ancestral rites those slain. So it will be the prisons where guards are recycled to the Gazas of the world, the prisons where the slaves of forced labor produce the munitions that kill their comrades, freedom fighting across borders, the prisons where the captured undergo Palestine-tested torture, the prisons where our political prisoners are hidden from sight, the prisons where our daughters and sons from the campuses are being locked up today. It will be the unliberated prisons. Turn next time. You've been listening to the words of Julia Wright and her poem, The Prisons Next Time. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Musa Springer, pro-Cuba solidarity activist and journalist, and Shaquille Fontenot, co-chair of the National Network on Cuba and filmmaker. Thank you both for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles.
Definitely. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Comrade Springer, why are you helping Comrade Fontenot produce a film on Blacks in Cuba?
Absolutely. Well, and first off, again, want to thank you for being here to speak with you, because in part, your work around Cuba, Dr. Horne, has helped laid some of the groundwork for us to even understand, the blockade, the U.S. blockade against Cuba and the Cuban Revolution in its proper context and history. And so, I am more than just a pro-Cuba activist. I'm a member of the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, and we can talk more about that organization later if you'd like. And what we do is essentially popular education work, in the sense of someone like Paulo Freire or Amilcar Cabral. It's community organizing at the neighborhood level against, the colonial ideas that may be left over after the revolution, is how I like to frame it. And an important thing to remember is the revolution is around 65 years old, give or take. But colonialism itself in Cuba and the region, of course, is 400 to 500 years. And so with all of this in mind, I think myself and Shaquille and Joshua Parks, our other producer and filmmaker on this project, through our solidarity work with Cuba, first and foremost, both of us are involved in organizing delegations, doing lots of political education work here in the US about Cuba. I think that prompted us to be just hyper aware of the ways that Africans in the US are targeted by anti-Cuba propaganda uniquely and specifically. Black people in the US are told Cuba is a horrible, racist place. Communism is racist. And then the reality, when you get to Cuba, is so different. You realize this is an African nation, and this was an African revolution that they had and that they are still organizing to sustain. And so that's a little bit about why we want to, tell the narrative of what community organizers in Cuba are doing, because it's sustaining the revolution. In some ways, it's like a revolution within the revolution. And so, our documentary highlights some of the organizers and activists, artists, and just regular day Cubans and how they're surviving and organizing despite one of the longest, most barbaric and illegal blockades certainly in modern history.
So what's the timetable for when our audience can view this documentary?
We're aiming to have a rough cut of the documentary later this summer, and we'll be sharing it with those that are featured first and foremost. And then once we have our conversations with distributors, it'll have a more concrete public viewing timeline, but we're hoping in the next year to have a public launch of the film.
Elaborating on that last point, talk to us about the impact of the blockade that has already been referenced, and why do you feel that Black Americans in particular should be concerned about this?
So the blockade against Cuba affects not only Afro-Cubans that we're highlighting and featuring, but also affects individuals in the United States that wish to normalize relations with Cuba. I specifically was working with a group of Black farmers last year, and a lot of them had visited the island and expressed the desire to trade with Cubans and being unable to do so as a result of the blockade and Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terror. So beyond not being able to access basic infrastructural improvement materials, medicine, certain food items, certain technology enhancements, and most crucially, medical supplies, basic medical supplies. That is a large focus of what we bring on our delegations to support the Cuban people. But it's just, the blockade has really positioned Afro-Cubans in a unique position because, as Musa was mentioning earlier, the revolution within a revolution that we see in these communities is doubly impacted, almost triply impacted by the effects of the U.S. economic blockade. We have specialized resources and tools that we need as African descendant peoples that we're also unable to get as a result of the U.S. economic blockade. Musa, did you want to fill in some there?
Yeah, I think you did a wonderful job. And I would just add, sometimes it's very difficult for people in the U.S., I think, to even conceptualize what it means to live under a blockade for 6 decades and counting. If you could imagine waking up and you have to have a very simple operation at the hospital, but there's no gloves at the hospital or PPE, and your surgeon calls you that morning and asks you to find and bring gloves and masks for him to wear during your surgery. This is a real story that my Cuban friends have gone through. Or you go to the store and there's no baby formula, there's no meat or food on the shelves. The kind of items that the Cubans that we help organize to bring as donations, they're asking for things like ibuprofen, allergy medication, antidiarrheals. These are the very, very basic things that the blockade denies. In this regard, I think it's kind of like an open air prison. It cuts off the Cuban ability to travel. It cuts off their access to food. It cuts off their access to medications, including a lot of life-saving treatments, including gender-affirming care for TLGBTQ people and so forth. And so I would also describe it honestly as genocidal. The results to Cuba from this blockade are really hard to understand because they're very profound. And then of course, adding Cuba to the state sponsor of terrorism list, Trump kind of ratcheted up or increased, if you will, this aggression against Cuba, and Biden has maintained that position on the state sponsor of terrorism list and has in fact become even more aggressive towards Cuba in the U.S. foreign policy.
We're seeing the parallel between what's happening with the aggression, increasing military, economic, biological, psychological, the attempts to eliminate African people and their populations in the United States, particularly the Black Belt region, parallels what Afro-Cubans are experiencing as well.
Exactly. And my final point too is, something, and Shaquille, you're one of the ones who actually helped teach me this language, is like, we now say all the time, there's also a blockade for Black people and other colonized populations here in the U.S. I'm in a state right now, Georgia, where there's a 6-week abortion ban. That's a literal blockade on healthcare for millions of birthing people in the region, right? And so the connections aren't even just theoretical, but they're very material. And the impact, like Shaquille said, is not just on Cubans, but it also impacts us in the U.S. as well.
Well, could you elaborate on the point you referenced earlier? That is to say, the RBA. Go into some detail about what it is.
Absolutely. The RBA is, excuse me, the RBA stands for the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, loosely translates to the Afro-Descendant Neighborhood Network. So listeners should know it, the Centro Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther King Center in Havana, Cuba, they actually systematically train organizers and community activists in popular education. So it's kind of a scientific approach, if you will, on how to organize a community through the means of popular education, as you know, it was defined by pretty much, I would say, like Jose Marti and Paulo Freire. So in 2012, there were 4 black women, black Cuban women, Maritza Lopez McBean, Idelsi, Damayanti, and Moraima, who went through this course at the Martin Luther King Center. And in 2012, they essentially all graduated, and then they said, well, let's put it into action. And they formed these neighborhood networks. And so it's not really an organization per se. You know, in Cuba, there's not this massive nonprofit sector like we have here in the US. So people have to reconceptualize how they think about civil society a little bit. So it's a network of projects, dozens of projects across Havana and Matanzas that center on Black Cuban and sort of Afro-descendant Cuban experiences and struggles. Very strong feminist and anti-racist lens as well. And it's also important to state that they are actually supported by and supportive of the government. The highest level, the president of the Republic of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, actually came and visited Maritza Lopez McBean, the head of the RBA, at her home, and then came and toured the community center that she helps run. And they've supported in other ways. And so I think it's always important to mention that these are revolutionary Africans who are doing this. And then finally, just to describe some of the kind of projects they do, there's everything from projects that teach and promote love for African features like your skin and your hair texture, your nose, your African clothing through hip hop. There are African religious programs that are part of this project. There's a really strong group called Afro Diverso, and it's a Black LGBTQ group, pretty much the first, group or project on the island to focus specifically on Black TLGBTQ people. And they were a big hand behind the recent passing of the Family Code in 2022. And so this is actually the organization that forms the basis of our documentary, The Red Barrial. And we're hoping, to show the example of like what organizing looks like when you're not organizing against a state that wants to kill you, but instead you're organizing in a socialist state that is supporting your movement, and how radically different that is.
So, Shaquille Fontenot, I think it was Musa Springer who mentioned that Matanzas is his favorite city, but I take it that you visited there as well. And what is your assessment of this Cuban city?
I love Matanzas. It's not only gorgeous, but there's just a familial connection you get when you touch there, and it's quite incredible thinking about. And for me, it's a really personal connection because I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and knowing the history and legacy of enslavement in both Cuba and in South Carolina, and seeing the interconnectedness between the food, the fashion, the cultural, the music, the rumba in Cuba, and particularly in Matanzas, I think that is just a gorgeous place to be. And it makes me dive even deeper into the reasons why I need to continue to support Cuba and the Afro-Cuban family that I've made there. So Musa definitely describes it as Little Africa. And I could say the same thing about Charleston. So it's almost like being home when I visit there.
So, Musa Springer, we know that a reason for the blockade against Cuba by the United States has been strident objection to Cuban foreign policy, particularly as it relates to Africa. So talk to us about the Cuban role in Africa, not least the dispatching of medics and soldiers.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked this question. And, something I like to say is they're calling Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, but if you know Cuba's history, is actually a state sponsor of African liberation. And I think it's really important to frame it that way, because historically, Cuba has held many Pan-African commitments, right? We often look at Cuba's role in many African liberation movements, for example, Angola, and to an extent South Africa, against apartheid. Cuba played a decisive role in supporting those struggles. Beyond that, though, I think also the Cuban educational support around the world also often gets overlooked, particularly across the continent of Africa. Cuba's revolutionary literacy programs following the revolution were pretty much the most successful literacy programs that we had ever seen at that level and that scale. It turned an island from around, I believe, 60% literacy to 98 to 99% literacy in under a year. And so they actually had several Cuban educators who scientifically looked at the successes of this campaign and then traveled around. They were invited to Ghana, and during the revolutionary period. They were in Burkina Faso. Cuban educators helped instill literacy campaigns in these other countries, also including Nicaragua and Venezuela. And then, of course, there's Cuba's medical diplomacy, which sometimes is all people talk about, but it's never enough. Cuba has sent thousands of doctors around the world, and that's their form of diplomacy. That's their biggest export, is doctors. So not only does Cuba have one of the highest doctors per capita rate domestically, but then they're sending doctors specifically to critical locations, as they define it, locations that are rural and have rural access issues, locations that are impoverished, at times even war conflict, or in pandemic or critical moments. So if people remember the pandemonium around Ebola a few years ago, and then it kind of quietly, people just stopped talking about it, it was actually Cuban doctors who traveled to the Congo and other regions and played a very, very, very critical and decisive role in making sure that it did not become a global pandemic. Of course, in the US and Western media, we didn't hear that side of the story. They just simply stopped talking about it. But Cuba's contributions to the African continent, and the diaspora at large, if I had to explain it, it is support for development. They're providing people with the tools for development. You can speak with so many people from Grenada or Guyana or Jamaica, especially if you speak with our elders who grew up, between like the 70s through the 90s, and they'll tell you they loved their Cuban doctors and nurses that they can all remember going and meeting in the hospitals when they needed to, right? And so I could keep going on for a while because I love talking about this, but I think Shaquille might have a point or two to add as well.
Yeah, you stressed the medical solidarity that Cuba has always had. But beyond that, they also are training so many medical professionals and engineers. I recently went to a Cuban Solidarity conference in South Africa, and they went over the history of Cuban solidarity with Africa beyond that military support in Angola and Namibia, contributing to African liberation movements. As you mentioned, like that infrastructural support, the technical assistance, giving agricultural assistance, disaster relief assistance. I think Cuba tried to send doctors to the United States after Hurricane Katrina, and although the U.S. rejected that, I think that this just shows their commitment, their ongoing commitment to internationalism and anti-imperialism. So beyond the technical assistance, military support, medical training, they also, as you mentioned, Musa, are a state sponsor of African liberation. So helping to maintain those diplomatic relations and advocating for the interests of African nations outside of an imperialist context. So I think that as Cuba moves towards freedom, we'll continue to see that increased cultural exchange, the medical exchange, the infrastructural and technical assistance increasing. So it is really amazing to see their ongoing solidarity despite their own economic challenges. Cuba's been able to offer assistance not only to African nations, but so many nations around the world in their struggles for independence and self-determination.
Finally, Musa Springer, pro-Cuba solidarity activist and journalist, what websites would you point our audience to with regard to your activity and the National Network on Cuba?
Yeah, well, first off, again, thank you for having us. I would point listeners to hoodcommunist.org. I am one of the editors there, and we recently in February traveled to Cuba for the International Meeting of Left Publications. And we published all of our speeches and a collections of writings this past February about Cuba and the blockade that I would strongly recommend people go and read and check out to hear firsthand from Africans who traveled to Cuba very recently. On top of that, I would check out the National Network on Cuba. That is nnoc.org. That's nnoc.org for the National Network on Cuba, one of the organizations really leading the struggle. Shaquille is a phenomenal activist and organizer with the NNOC. And then finally, Shaquille is also with, and myself to an extent, the Low Country Action Committee out of Charleston, South Carolina. So check out, that's lctakesaction.com.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Musa Springer, pro-Cuba solidarity activist and journalist, and Shaquille Fontenot, co-chair of National Network on Cuba and filmmaker. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Freedom Now Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne.
So we'll broadcast in the next few weeks, and I'll certainly let you know when.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Isaac Saney from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. Find a Black-owned bookstore near you and get his book, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. Next up, we thank Musa Springer and Shaquille Fontenot for joining us to speak on all things Cuba. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and ancestor Baba Dinan Kamathi for giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. You can even go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for a revolution.